When former Marine Staff Sergeant David Chen set out for what he thought would be a routine solo hike through the rugged wilderness of Colorado's San Juan Mountains, he never imagined he'd return with a story that would challenge everything experts knew about wild animal behavior. What started as a veteran's quest for solitude turned into an extraordinary bond that defied nature itself, proving that sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as David adjusted his weathered backpack and checked his GPS one final time. 3 years had passed since his last deployment in Afghanistan, but the nightmares still haunted him. His therapist at the VA hospital had recommended spending time in nature, suggesting that the peace and quiet might help calm his restless mind. What she hadn't mentioned was that sometimes the wilderness has its own plans for healing. David had chosen the remote Weemanoosh Wilderness specifically because it offered hundreds of miles of trails where he could disappear for days without encountering another soul. As a decorated combat veteran who had served 4 tours overseas, he craved the kind of silence that only untouched nature could provide. The weight of his military-grade camping gear felt familiar on his shoulders, a comforting reminder of skills that would never leave him, even in civilian life. The trail ahead wound through dense forests of aspen and pine, eventually climbing toward alpine meadows that stretched endlessly under the Colorado sky. David had planned a 5-day circuit that would take him deep into some of the most isolated terrain in the lower 48 states. He'd studied the maps for weeks, plotting water sources and camping spots with the same precision he'd once used to plan military operations. This wasn't just a hike for him. It was a mission to find something he'd lost somewhere between the battlefield and home. As he took his first steps onto the narrow dirt path, David had no idea that within hours he would encounter a wild bobcat whose behavior would baffle wildlife experts and ultimately change both their lives forever. The reason behind what happened next would reveal a truth so profound about the connection between wounded souls that it would restore David's faith in the healing power of unexpected friendship. The first 2 days of David's hike passed without incident, offering him the solitude he desperately needed. He followed well-marked trails through towering pine forests, stopping occasionally to photograph wildflowers or simply sit in silence, listening to the wind whisper through the branches. Each night he set up camp with military precision, his movements automatic and efficient from years of field experience. The familiar routine of checking his perimeter, securing his food, and preparing his sleeping area brought him a sense of order that had been missing from his civilian life. On the 3rd morning, as David packed up his campsite near a crystal-clear mountain stream, he noticed something unusual. Fresh tracks in the soft mud along the water's edge caught his attention immediately. His military training had taught him to be observant, and these prints were unmistakably feline, with 4 distinct toe pads and no claw marks showing. The size and shape indicated a bobcat, which wasn't particularly surprising in this remote wilderness area. What struck him as odd was how fresh the tracks appeared, as if the animal had visited the stream sometime during the night while he slept just 50 yards away. David studied the prints more carefully, noting their direction and spacing. The bobcat had approached the water from the dense underbrush on the opposite side of the stream, drunk its fill, and then, strangely, the tracks seemed to circle his campsite at a distance before disappearing back into the forest. Most wildcats, especially bobcats, would avoid human presence entirely. The fact that this one had lingered near his camp suggested either unusual boldness or something else entirely. As he shouldered his pack and began hiking deeper into the wilderness, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times throughout the morning, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart between trees just outside his direct line of sight. His combat instincts, honed by years of staying alert in hostile territory, told him something was tracking him, but every time he stopped to scan the forest carefully, using techniques he'd learned in reconnaissance training, He saw nothing but empty wilderness. The feeling persisted as the day wore on, growing stronger rather than fading. By afternoon, David was certain he had a follower, though he couldn't understand why any predator would trail a human for hours without making its intentions known. By late afternoon, David's suspicions were confirmed in the most unexpected way. As he crested a rocky ridge overlooking a vast alpine meadow, he decided to take a water break and scan the terrain behind him with his military-grade binoculars. What he saw through the lenses made him freeze completely. Approximately 200 yards down the trail, a magnificent bobcat sat motionless on a fallen log, its golden eyes fixed directly on him. The animal showed no signs of aggression or fear, simply watching with an intensity that sent chills down David's spine. David lowered his binoculars slowly, his mind racing through his options. His military training had prepared him for many dangerous situations, but none of his survival manuals had covered what to do when a wild predator decided to become your hiking companion. Bobcats were typically solitary, elusive creatures that avoided human contact at all costs. This behavior was completely outside the normal parameters of wildlife encounters. The logical choice would be to make noise, appear large, and scare the animal away. But something about the bobcat's posture and expression stopped him from taking that action. Instead, David found himself caught in an impossible dilemma that went against everything he knew about wilderness safety. The bobcat wasn't displaying any threatening behavior, stalking, crouching, or showing signs of territorial aggression. If anything, the animal seemed almost curious, tilting its head slightly as it continued to observe him from its perch. David's training told him to create distance immediately, to treat any wild predator as a potential threat to his safety. But his intuition, developed through years of reading situations and people in combat zones, suggested something entirely different was happening here. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meadow as David wrestled with his decision. Should he trust his military protocols and attempt to drive the bobcat away, potentially putting both of them in danger if the animal felt cornered? Or should he continue hiking and see if the strange following behavior would eventually stop on its own? The choice seemed simple, but something deep in his gut told him this encounter was different from anything described in wilderness survival guides. As David stood there weighing his options, the bobcat remained perfectly still, neither advancing nor retreating, as if it had been waiting for him to make the first move in what had become the most unusual standoff of his life. David made a decision that would have shocked his drill instructors and wilderness experts alike. Instead of attempting to scare the bobcat away, he slowly shouldered his pack and continued hiking at his normal pace, choosing to see what would happen next. As he descended into the alpine meadow, he glanced back periodically and confirmed his suspicions. The bobcat was indeed following him, maintaining that same precise distance of roughly 200 yards. What happened over the next several hours defied every piece of conventional wisdom about wild animal behavior. The bobcat moved with David like a shadow, stopping when he stopped, resuming movement when he continued hiking. During his afternoon rest break beside a mountain lake, David watched in amazement as the bobcat emerged from the tree line and approached the same water source, but only after David had moved a safe distance away. The animal drank calmly, groomed itself briefly, and then retreated to the forest edge to wait for David to resume his journey. As evening approached and David began searching for a suitable campsite, the bobcat's behavior became even more extraordinary. Instead of disappearing into the wilderness as any normal wildcat would do at nightfall, the animal positioned itself on a rocky outcropping about 50 yards from where David was setting up his tent. The bobcat sat sphinx-like, alert and watchful, as if it had appointed itself as David's unofficial guardian for the night. David's military experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct told him this situation was unprecedented. He'd served in regions where wildlife encounters were common, had been briefed on animal behavior in various terrains, but nothing in his training explained why a solitary predator would choose to accompany a human stranger through miles of wilderness. Wilderness. The bobcat's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and David found himself wondering if the animal was studying him as intently as he was studying it. That night, as David prepared his simple camp meal, he made another decision that surprised even himself. He deliberately left a small portion of his dried meat on a flat rock between his campsite and the bobcat's position. It wasn't an attempt to feed or domesticate the wild animal, but rather a gesture of acknowledgement, a way of saying he understood they were sharing this space together, at least for tonight. The next morning, David discovered the meat was gone, and fresh bobcat tracks showed the animal had approached during the night while he slept. More unsettling was the realization that the tracks circled his entire campsite multiple times, as if the bobcat had been patrolling his perimeter like a sentry. When David emerged from his tent at dawn, the bobcat was already in position on its rocky vantage point, waiting patiently for the day's journey to begin. By the fourth day, their unusual partnership had developed into a routine that both fascinated and concerned David. The bobcat had closed the distance between them to roughly 100 yards, still maintaining respect for David's space, but clearly becoming more comfortable with their arrangement. David began talking to the animal during rest stops, his voice carrying across the mountain silence as he shared stories about his deployments, his struggles with civilian life, and his reasons for seeking solitude in these remote mountains. The turning point came when David encountered two aggressive black bears near a berry patch along the trail. As the bears noticed David and began displaying threatening behavior, standing on their hind legs and huffing warnings, David reached for his bear spray while calculating his escape routes. Before he could react further, the bobcat appeared between David and the bears, its back arched and emitting a series of fierce growls and hisses that echoed through the forest. The bears, apparently as surprised by this intervention as David was, backed down and lumbered away into the thick undergrowth. David stood frozen, watching the bobcat slowly relax its defensive posture and return to its normal, calm demeanor. The animal had just risked its own safety to protect him, behavior that was not just unusual, but completely contrary to every known pattern of wild bobcat conduct. This wasn't simple curiosity or coincidental following anymore. This was deliberate protection, as if the bobcat had decided David was worth defending. That evening, as David sat by his small campfire, processing what had happened, he noticed the bobcat had moved even closer, now positioned only 30 yards away. For the first time, he could clearly see the animal's facial features in the firelight. What he observed there would change his understanding of their connection forever. The bobcat's left ear was partially missing, and a long scar ran across its shoulder. Old wounds that spoke of previous encounters with danger, perhaps even violence. As David studied the bobcat's scars more closely by firelight, a disturbing realization began to form in his mind. The pattern of the wounds, particularly the damaged ear and the clean line of the shoulder scar, looked disturbingly familiar. Having treated wounded soldiers and seen the aftermath of combat injuries, David recognized signs that suggested these weren't natural wounds from territorial fights or accidents. The scarring pattern looked deliberate, methodical, like the kind of damage inflicted by humans rather than other animals. The fifth morning brought an unwelcome interruption to their wilderness sanctuary. David heard the distant rumble of ATVs long before he saw them, and his heart sank as he realized other people were entering their isolated domain. A group of 4 hunters emerged from the forest, their vehicles loaded with camping gear and what appeared to be tracking equipment. David's military training immediately assessed the group, their aggressive body language, the way they handled their weapons, and their obvious disregard for leave-no-trace principles as they left trash and damaged vegetation in their wake. When the lead hunter, a heavy-set man with cold eyes, spotted David's campsite, the group approached with an attitude that immediately put David on edge. "You seen any cats around here? We've been tracking a bobcat with a busted ear for 3 days. Damn thing's been raiding our hunting camps and needs to be dealt with." The way he said "dealt with" while caressing his rifle made David's stomach turn. David's protective instincts, the same ones that had kept his unit safe overseas, flared to life. He lied smoothly, telling the hunters he'd seen no wildlife except some deer and a few birds. But even as he spoke, David caught a glimpse of golden fur moving through the trees behind his campsite. The bobcat was still there, still watching, apparently unaware of the danger these men represented. The hunters seemed suspicious of David's answer, and their leader stepped closer, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "You military boys think you're real smart, don't you? That cat's got a bounty on it for property damage. Anyone harboring it or interfering with our hunt is gonna have problems." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke as the group mounted their ATVs and roared away. But David knew they hadn't gone far. The real danger to his unlikely companion had just arrived, and David faced the most important decision of his entire hiking trip. That night, David made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He broke camp in complete darkness, using night vision techniques learned in Special Forces to navigate without alerting the hunters to his movement. The bobcat, as if sensing the danger, had vanished completely after the hunters' visit, but David knew the animal was still somewhere nearby. He also knew those men would return at first light, and when they did, they'd be hunting for blood. David hiked through the darkness for 6 grueling hours, pushing deeper into the most remote section of the wilderness where ATVs couldn't follow. His military-grade GPS and night navigation skills guided him along treacherous mountain paths that few civilians would attempt even in daylight. Every step was calculated to leave minimal trace while putting maximum distance between himself and the hunting party. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now the one being hunted, protecting a wild animal that had somehow decided he was worth protecting. As dawn broke over a hidden valley David had never seen on any map, he finally allowed himself a brief rest. That's when the bobcat reappeared, emerging from the shadows like a ghost. But this time, the animal's behavior was entirely different. Instead of maintaining its respectful distance, the bobcat approached directly, stopping just 10 feet away. For the first time in their 5-day journey together, the animal made a low, almost purring vocalization that seemed to convey both gratitude and trust. David extended his hand slowly, and in a moment that defied everything he had ever learned about wild animals, the bobcat stepped forward and briefly touched its nose to his fingertips. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that instant, David understood something profound was happening between them. This wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about 2 wounded souls who had somehow found healing in each other's presence. The sound of distant ATV engines echoing through the valley shattered their moment of connection. The hunters had found their trail and were closing in fast. David grabbed his pack and started moving toward higher ground, knowing that the rocky terrain ahead would force their pursuers to continue on foot. The bobcat immediately fell into position beside him, no longer following, but now traveling as his partner in what had become a desperate escape through some of Colorado's most unforgiving wilderness. The chase through the high country lasted 2 more days, with David and the bobcat moving as a coordinated team through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. The animal's knowledge of hidden game trails and water sources proved invaluable, while David's military navigation skills kept them moving toward the safety of a national park boundary where hunting was prohibited. During their desperate flight, the bobcat never left David's side, often scouting ahead and returning to guide him around dangerous obstacles or away from areas where the hunters might be waiting. On the 7th day, as they finally crossed into protected territory, David collapsed from exhaustion beside a pristine mountain lake. The bobcat approached him more closely than ever before, settling down just arm's length away. As David caught his breath and refilled his water bottles, he noticed something extraordinary. The bobcat was wearing a collar, so faded and worn that it was barely visible beneath its thick fur. With infinite patience and gentleness, he managed to examine the collar and found a tiny corroded metal tag. The name on the tag read Shadow, and beneath it, barely legible, were the words Military Working Animal, K9 Unit 47th Infantry. David's heart stopped as the pieces of an impossible puzzle suddenly fell into place. This wasn't just any wild bobcat. This was a former military animal, one that had somehow ended up in the Colorado wilderness, scared and alone. The hunting party wasn't after a random predator. They were pursuing a veteran, just like David himself. The healing that followed over the next several months was mutual and profound. David contacted military animal welfare organizations and discovered that Shadow had been declared missing in action 3 years earlier during a transport accident in the mountains. The bobcat had survived in the wild, but never forgotten its training or its bond with soldiers. When Shadow had encountered David on that mountain trail, it had recognized something familiar, a fellow warrior who understood the weight of service and the challenge of coming home. David's nightmares gradually faded as he and Shadow built a new life together on a small ranch outside Colorado Springs. The bobcat, while retaining its wild instincts, became David's constant companion, helping him transition back into civilian life with the same loyalty it had once shown on the battlefield. Their story proved that sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from traditional therapy, but from the unexpected connection between two souls who have both seen too much but refuse to give up on finding peace. Today, David and Shadow work together at a specialized program for veterans struggling with PTSD, where their unique bond demonstrates the healing power of interspecies connections. Shadow, now officially recognized as a therapy animal, helps other former service members find the same peace that he and David discovered in each other. The Colorado Department of Wildlife granted Shadow special status as an educational ambassador, making their partnership legally recognized and protected. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a wildlife behavioral specialist who studied their case, described their relationship as unprecedented in the scientific literature. She documented how Shadow retained all his wild instincts while displaying loyalty behaviors typically seen only in domestic animals. This bobcat chose his human, Dr. Martinez explained. In 3 years of research, we've never seen anything comparable to the bond between David and Shadow. The ranch where they live has become a sanctuary for other retired military animals, and David regularly speaks at veteran centers across the country. His message is simple. Healing doesn't always come in the form you expect, and sometimes the very thing you think you're saving ends up saving you instead. Shadow accompanies him to these speaking engagements, demonstrating that trust and loyalty transcend species boundaries. Visitors often ask David what he learned from his week in the wilderness with Shadow. His answer never changes: that sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't against an enemy, but against the isolation and pain we carry inside. Shadow taught me that healing happens when two broken souls decide to protect each other instead of facing their demons alone. Their story continues to inspire thousands of veterans and animal lovers worldwide, proving that the most extraordinary relationships often begin with the simplest act of not walking away when someone needs you most. What incredible animal story has touched your life? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales of unlikely friendships that prove love truly knows no boundaries. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring content.